the way the West always talks about it. Oh, U.S. Army is so much superior to the Russian Army. And you've seen firsthand sort of the best and worst of both sides. So put that into perspective.
Well, I'll say the Russian army has greatly improved. The problem was when the Russian army came in 22, it was pretty disorganized. The only good thing that, as a friend of mine in military intelligence here said, the only thing that was saving us is they were worse off than we were. They were less organized than we were. But the problem was, it's the same problem the U.S. military has right now.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian military kind of followed the U.S. military and stopped practicing working in division and brigade levels and started working in individual battalion levels. And Syria, of course, only propagated that because they only had about a battalion's worth there, or still do. The same thing is going to happen with the U.S. The U.S. now wants to prepare for war with the big boys. Well, you've got to relearn everything you stopped learning 20 years ago. How to operate in more than a battalion that's spread out in individual companies, and individual companies spread out individual platoon bases. Now you've got to figure out how to function as a large entity in a structure of even larger entities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually pretty hard. And I mean, I'll give you an example. This is one of those no-brainers. I turned down major's rank. I was captain promotable. I turned down major's rank. But I'm pretty sure if I needed to, I was well enough trained, I can run a battalion. But it's one of those no shit moments because I'm driving down. I started driving, going down there with people back in December of 22, 24th of December. It was the fact that the Poles were sitting across from where we were at that I'm still alive. I'm pretty sure of that. I'll tell you that in a minute. But you got people complaining. Then we're talking to guys. I've got people complaining that, well, that battalion leaves. We don't know they leave. I'm like, well, don't you have a liaison from that battalion's headquarters and your headquarters? No. Do you have your liaison? No. That's basics. You got to have it works that way now. And yes, it's in Soviet and Russian doctrine, just like in the U.S. and any other major army. But they had unlearned that. They had gone down to brigade level and brigade working as individual battalions, and they had lost that basic knowledge. It had to be something that had to be relearned.
Right.
You can't function. One battalion goes on the to attack. Nobody else knows. You got an open perimeter, and then you got Ukrainian units start coming in behind it, or to certain end, because nobody knows that there's now an open perimeter. Or they move over to a slightly, 2 kilometers to the left, and nobody's told anybody, and you got a 2-kilometer hole in your perimeter. And honestly, at the very beginning, it was so haphazard. The guys on the ground, they didn't know where the hell the Ukrainians were. I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians didn't know where the hell the Russian army was. It was just, and I had a friend of mine who was gone down there several times with, and he did a lot of, he went through a lot of different channels, and he would map it out. He's civilian guy. Well, he's former police inspector. And he'd map it out, and he would come down there and he'd share the electronic maps with everybody. Like, oh, shit, village next door there, you got Ukrainian presence. Like, yeah. You didn't know that? No. Because communication was just, and everything's gotten, it's gotten up and up, 23, 24, that, the learning curve is steep.
Right.
But 22, and the casualty rates were high, beginning of 22 comparatively, because everybody wanted to be a hero. And that's a problem. Everybody wants to be a hero. Every officer wanted to make a name for himself. This is going to be real short. We got to make a name for ourselves, blah, blah, blah. And everybody's trying to be a hero. And heroes get people killed.
Right.
Themselves included.
Yeah.
Now, don't be a hero. Just do your job.
Yeah.
There's enough shit to go around. Everybody's going to get a bite out of that sandwich.
What we've seen evolve, and I see at least 3-4 phases for the Russia. When Russia went in initially, I think, the plan was apply enough military pressure to get negotiations, but we'll get this thing negotiated. And then that blew up. And then they had all the contract soldiers starting to bail out in August and realized, whoops, we got a manpower problem. So they got to mobilize. And then they upped the conscription levels in November and December. And so then started rebuilding the army. And then by June, They're fully, that was sort of that period, September to the following June, I call phase two. Phase three was then fighting back the NATO planned and directed counteroffensive that failed. And in the process, that's, I think I looked at it as that's where the Army turned in terms of really starting to defeat the NATO proxy. And then it continued into 2024 with, the Western military analysts not understanding the concept of a war of attrition and constantly accusing Russia and engaged in, full-on human wave attacks. And while not appreciating that at the same, I wonder at what point, and maybe you have some insight into this, did the Russian general staff wake up and go, "Holy Mother of God, we're attriting NATO. We never realized they were this shallow." I think the general staff may have believed that there was actually a lot more strategic depth in the West than has in fact been the case. What's your take?
A friend of mine told me, who was a captain in the airborne special forces back in, I think he got relieved back in '92 when all these officers were getting fired.
Uh-huh.
He was, well, I won't say relieved. He got cut with everybody else. But he was telling me, as a cadet, we're going through training, and they're telling us, "Oh, you're not good enough because those NATO special forces, those NATO guys are just going to cut right through all of you." Blah 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 blah. So they really overinflated. And then the '90s was just a bad time in Russian period.
Yeah.
And everyone's looking at the West like, "Wow, we're inadequate pond scum, and you are the gods." And in business, there's still a degree of that. I did a lot of work in U.S. corporations, and I worked for an Italian corporation too as a director. And you're looking around like, "God, you guys are idiots." I work for Halliburton, for God's sakes, one of the most corrupt companies in the world. I was brought in to put them back on their feet because they go in waves. They steal, everything collapses. You bring people that can actually get everything back up on their feet, but those people tend to be honest.
Yeah.
And then you got to get rid of them because they're now blocking your. And I was blocking so much corruption until my senior VP in Houston got fired, and then his entire senior team got removed because we were all in the path of rekindling the corruption. Okay, we waited 2 years. You got everything back on its feet. We want to be, we got to earn, and you're our way.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. They looked at it. The beginning, the very beginning was a really a bad phase. It wasn't the contracted guys didn't leave later. They left at the very beginning because Russia, now it does, but it didn't at that moment have what is called in the military needs of the Army.
Mm-hmm.
The needs of the Army means we don't give a damn you have a contract. If your MOS is needed, buddy, you ain't leaving. You'll retire before we let you go.
Yeah,
that's how it's going to be. Sorry, but needs of the Army trumps any contract. Russia didn't have that at the very beginning, and when the balloon went up, about a third of the officers quit. Like, whoa! I didn't sign up to fight. I just signed up to get bennies and make a good. And a lot of the other conscripted soldiers, they all, okay, we're quit. They stopped that. But the other problems became, you had a lot of these volunteer units. And a lot of those guys will quit. They come in there, see that this is a real fight, and about a third of the volunteers will turn around and go, okay, bye-bye, I'm gone. Because these are strictly volunteer units. The big turnaround really started with that, and which, by the way, helped cause Prigozhin's little rebellion, was when the territories became part of Russia. Officially, because by Russian law, no military organization that is not part of the Ministry of Defense is allowed to function on Russian territory. So all these volunteer battalions, brigades, Cossack battalions, actually the Cossack brigades pretty much have stood their ground. As a Kuban Cossack, I can say they stood their ground. They more of a brotherhood. The various volunteer battalions, a lot of them had a high attrition rate of people running away or just leaving on leave and not coming back. But after that, what happened, once those territories become Russian, all of these independent units are now leaving. So they went in, the military went in, I mean, this is still Shoigu, and brought in stacks of contracts. Gentlemen, this is if you're going to stay, you sign a contract. And everybody signed contracts. Once those contracts are signed, you can't, I mean, you still have people that'll go AWOL here and there, but now it's under, they get under a legal obligation. And they can be put in, they can get arrested and they can be prosecuted for getting AWOL because, you've signed a contract. And that, by the way, the only unit that didn't sign a contract was Prigozhin. And there were meatways. Prigozhin was making meatways.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about joining because when mobilization hit, I wrote to the administration. I had two generals behind me. I was like, hey, give me major's rank. I'll come back here. I'll go fight. I'm a combat officer. And this is my hometown is Lugansk getting shelled.